Assalamu alaikum. This is the 11th lecture for Software Requirements Engineering. We will be talking about requirements elicitation today. In particular, we will be talking about interviewing as a requirements elicitation technique, although we'll discuss some others also. But our emphasis today would be on different aspects of conducting interviews and what other things are involved. You can see that I've listed 4 specific elicitation techniques: interviews, scenarios, observations, and social analysis, and requirements reuse. There are others also like prototyping, but today our focus mainly would be on interviews, and we'll discuss other techniques also briefly. What are interviews? Interview is a meeting which can be between 2 people or between a group of people. The requirements engineer or analyst discusses the system with one or more stakeholders and builds up their requirements. That is, builds up stakeholders' requirements or requirements for the system. Interviews are very useful for getting information about that product, but they are less effective for understanding application domains and organizational issues due to terminology and political factors. So for these things, that is domain understanding and for organizational understanding, other techniques are more useful. For example, reading documents and observing how things work are very useful for these 2 kinds of things, that is, building up domain knowledge and uncovering or understanding the organizational structure and organizational processes in a company or in an organization. Interviews are very useful for data gathering, and we will be focusing on such interviews today. There are 2 types of interviews: closed interviews and open interviews. Closed interviews are those where the requirements engineer is looking for answers to predefined set of questions. And open interviews are those interviews in which there is no predefined agenda, and requirements engineers discuss what the stakeholders want in an open-ended fashion. However, as we will discuss this in more detail today, it is to be noted that neither of these 2 approaches will be completely successful, and so they must be combined together. That is, the requirements engineers must have a certain predefined set of questions which will result in an answer from the stakeholders. Then requirements engineers can discuss those answers and ask questions based on the information given by the stakeholders. Let's look at what are the essentials for interviews to be conducted. Interviewers, that is the requirements engineers, must be open-minded and should not approach the interview with preconceived notions about what is required. That is, every requirements engineer, when he or she goes for an interview, must listen to the interviewee and be open-minded about what information will be given to it. And it should not discard information because of or based on the preconceived ideas of him or herself. Stakeholders must be given a starting point for discussion. This can be a question, a requirements proposal, or an existing system. Now, this is what I was saying a couple of minutes ago, that a mixing of closed interviews with open interviews are going to be better for discovering the needs and requirements from the stakeholders. Interviewers must be aware of organizational politics. Many real problems may not be discussed because of their political implications, And this point has to be fully understood by requirements engineers. And I've said this before throughout the semester, that requirements engineers must understand the organizational bias that exists in almost every organization. And because the stakeholders are operating at different levels, there are end users and there is top management and then there is middle management. Each of them has their own interests and each of them may not be able to clearly and vocally describe their needs. They may not be able to communicate verbally what they think about the project. However, they do convey this type of information through non-verbal communication, by gestures, by making faces and things like that. And so these are also part of the interviews, and requirements engineers must learn to interpret the message that we will see later in the lecture today. What are the steps involved for an interview? First is preparation. Second is the actual conducting of the interview. And third is follow-through. And we will take each one of these steps and talk about them in detail. What is involved in preparation for the interview? Now, we have talked about developing a predefined set of questions. Now, before these questions are developed, a requirements engineer needs to define the purpose and objectives for the interview, determine whether the interview should be conducted by one person or a team, and if a team is going to interview stakeholders, then define roles for team members, that is, who's the team lead and what are the different roles that they have to play. Third, very important point is contact the interviewee to arrange time, place, and logistics of the interview and outline the purpose and format. So once the objective has been determined, once the team has been made in place, then the interviewee must be contacted to get a convenient time, to arrange a convenient time and place, and to determine other logistics for the interview. For example, one may need a projector for an interview. A conference room may be needed if a team is going. Maybe the customer doesn't want the interview to be performed in his or her office. Maybe a neutral third-party location or a neutral location is to be selected and arranged for that purpose. So there is logistic work that needs to be conducted before an interview can really take place. Fourth, one has to obtain background information. And remember, we have talked about different types of background information in the last lecture, about the organization, about the business context, about the domain, and so forth. So these are the four things that must be done. And these are not actual four things, but these are four sets of things which must be accomplished before questions are developed for an interview. Once interviewee has been contacted, there's need to develop an interview guide which contains the names and titles of interviewee and date of interview. There may be follow-up interviews, there may be more than one stakeholder that needs to be interviewed, so all of that information has to be catalogued. A set of questions need to be developed, and a very important aspect of the question is that they have to be listed in the order that you would like to ask them. A very important suggestion is that you move from general questions to specific questions. You start off with question in a broader area and focus it as you go along in the interview. And this may happen in more than one interview. For example, in the first interview, you may only gather a basic overview of the proposed system, and in later follow-up interviews, specific details may be elicited through questioning. You have to include some questions which are open-ended to elicit what we call essay-type responses. For example, they start with, please describe this to me. Please describe this process to me. Considering the airline reservation, we can say, please describe the booking process or seat reservation process. Or you can say, please tell me how admission of a student is conducted, or how one can obtain a computerized driving license, for example. So, these will give you an essay type response, and they will also give you an insight on the priorities of the customers. And you must also include closed-ended questions to obtain specific information. For example, you can say, who is going to provide or authorize waivers in a particular situation? How much time is required? How much time can be tolerated by the stakeholders for the system to respond? Or where can I get this information? So you have to include both, as I had said before, open questions as well as closed questions. Open questions will give you essay type responses, while the closed questions will give you specific information. Now, the second step that you see listed on the chart is conducting of the interview. This is the real thing. This is the moment of truth that everyone who goes through a data gathering interview must realize, that there is an opening. You have to establish a repo and build trust and credibility. You have to make eye contact. You cannot just look under the table and talk to an interviewee. You will not be taken seriously. You have to shake hands depending on the culture, depending on the customs. If it's a team, you have to introduce the entire team, provide information about roles in the interview process. For example, if one person is taking notes, or one person is leading the entire process, or one person is particularly expert, that person needs to be introduced. And if a person, let's say, has come from a different city to take part in an interview, that shows the level of commitment and level of interest on the part of the developer, that they have obtained, or they have put an expert in this project, and that was going to certainly impress the customer. Then you have to clarify the purpose. Now you've started the interview, you have to clarify the purpose, time frame, and key objectives of that interview. And this is again the opening, and then you need to transition the core of the interview by leading into the first question. So you can have a specific question or an open question depending upon the nature of the problem that you're solving, but you need to start that interview. So once you have built you have exchanged customary gratitudes, and then you have stated the purpose and the expected time that it's going to take, and then you start the interview. That is the body of the interview. Remember, you have already prepared body of the interview. Those are the set of questions that were part of the interview guide that you had prepared. Once you ask questions, you are certainly going to get responses which you were not expecting. And those are the areas, and those are the times where you need to probe and follow up on the responses. You cannot just sit and say, listen, these are the questions that I've prepared, and I'm not going to deviate from these questions no matter what. No, you must use the responses intelligently to ask follow-up questions clarified, so that the information that you are achieving, that you are obtaining, is understood by you. You have to be flexible and open-minded. We have talked about that a little bit before. Listen actively, not just give an impression that you are somewhere else mentally. You must monitor their voice and body language, but you must monitor your voice and body language as well. Are you becoming hostile to the interviewee? If that's the case, you need to change your demeanor. Identify interviewees' main concerns. As I said before, that these are going to be provided to you in open-ended type answers, where the interviewees will give you their concerns, their lack of information, their lack of understanding about computing systems. And in some cases, you would hear responses like, I'm not sure what you guys can do for us. And that shows a little bit of mistrust or lack of understanding as far as the computerized systems are concerned. So you need to identify and record the interviewee's main concerns. And you need to continue to maintain a rapport with the interviewee. You need to take accurate notes. And you must not continue to talk. You should use silence and pauses to add life to the interview. Remember, this is not mathematics. This is social sciences. We are talking about one or more people discussing problem that needs to be solved. You need to ask for and obtain relevant documentation. If the documentation is available with the interviewee, you can ask them to give it to you at that moment. This is not a game of cricket. This is not a game of hockey that they cannot stop talking for a minute and pick up the document and give it to you. This is a social process. People are talking and they should be able to give you a relevant documentation if it's available, or they can ask someone at that moment to provide you with that. They can use telephone, or they can use email, or they can ask their secretarial staff to get that relevant document for you. And towards the end, you need to ask what is known as a catch-all question. That is the summarizing question that will sort of sum up the interview and also will highlight the concerns of the interviewee, and if there are more than one interviewee, then obviously the group of interviewees. And then you have to close the interview. That closing includes summarizing the findings and link them to the purpose, the objective of the project. You may ask, and actually you should ask the interviewee if they have any questions for you. And if they have, you must answer them and answer them correctly. And you must determine and agree on the next steps. You know, if it's a very specific, small interview, you can say that there is not a follow-up. But if there is a need for it, you must determine that, yes, we have gathered quite a bit of information and we need to meet again, because not all details are clear, because we'll go back and we'll organize our material and we'll perform a little bit of analysis and we'll probably talk about it next time and set the next meeting if necessary. And you must, at the end, thank the interviewee for his or her input and for taking the time to meet with you. Remember, we had said earlier that one of the problems that requirements engineers face is that customers, for one reason or the other, do not give enough time to the requirements engineers during the process of requirements elicitation. And there are many projects which fail because of this problem. And so you should be thankful to your customers that they had given you time and discussed the project with you. This is not only going to be useful for this current project, but also for any future projects that your company does with a client company. The last point that you see is follow-through. What is follow-through? Immediately after the interview, fill in your notes. Fill in your notes. Just be sure to jot down impressions and important ideas. Remember, we talked about the non-verbal message. Whenever someone is talking or sitting in an interview, that person is conveying or communicating non-verbal messages also. And those things are difficult to capture during the interview. So once an interview has been conducted, you must document that immediately and review any documentation that you have received during the interview. That, we talked about the fact that a lot of documentation is produced and is made available to the requirements engineers for understanding the domain and for talking about the business concerns and so forth. So you have to review those documents because they will then reflect on the understanding of the interview that you have just conducted. You may have to write an interview report for your management. If that is required, then you must do that as soon as possible. Follow up on leads obtained during the interview, which can consist of contacting other potential interviewees, and it can also consist of researching other data sources. So the information that you have received and the follow-up links that you have received as part of this interview must be followed up immediately. You can call another potential interview by saying that Mr. So-and-so has given me your reference and I'm working on this project and I will be very grateful if you can give me some time. And then you can go through the same exercise of preparing for an interview, conducting an interview, and then following through an interview. Remember that the follow-through interviews give you detailed information about different aspects of a project. For example, if your first interview leads into a very specific area, focused area within the project scope, then you can ask all the relevant questions in the second interview with a different stakeholder, with a different interviewee. That knowledge, that information may not be available with the first person which you have met. Another very important thing that you must do, step which you must take, is to follow up on the agreed upon next steps. Remember, we talked about developing a set of steps that must be followed up after the interview has been conducted, and you must do that. Sending a note of thanks to the interviewee, if appropriate, will build your rapport beyond regular customer developer or customer vendor relationship. In some cultures and some customs, it is very appropriate to send a thank you note. And in today's world, this is very easy. You can use email or you can use SMS, but email is certainly preferred. It is not only personal, but it is very easy. It is very convenient. It is very fast. And you don't have to make even an extra effort to send a note of thanks to the interviewee. One thing that must be said before we discuss other concepts is that you must listen to the customer. The art of listening is most important. You can best impress your client and do him a real service by listening. If you give an impression to your customer that you are listening to him or listening to her, then that customer will provide you more and accurate information. If the customer gets a feeling that the vendor is not listening to his or her requirements, then they will cease to give information. And controlling information is one of the problems that we have talked about as part of the problems in the requirements elicitation process. I was talking about listening as a very important part of interview. Let's consider what is listening. Listening steps consist of hearing, interpreting, responding, and evaluating. What is hearing or hearing the message? Listen to learn as much as possible so that you will know how to respond. So the first thing is listen to learn, not just sit as a dumb listener, but listen to learn. Give the speaker your undivided attention. Don't just wait for your turn to speak. So if the interviewee is getting the impression that you are not listening to me and just you are waiting for your turn to speak, the speaker or the interviewee will not be comfortable with providing you accurate information. Concentrate on the message, not on the person. So don't try to find faults with the interviewee, but try to concentrate on the message that is being delivered. Don't interrupt the speaker. If you have an urge to ask the question, let the speaker finish, and then you can ask it as a what we call probe question. You need to tune out distractions such as interfering noises, wandering thoughts, and emotional reactions to the speaker's message. Now, every human being goes through these unrelated things or events in human mind, but one needs to learn to tune them out while listening to what the interviewee is saying. And you need to suspend judgment about the message until you have heard all the facts. Don't jump on conclusions. Rather, wait till everything has been said, and then you can make the decision based on the facts. Take notes on the speaker's key points if appropriate, that is, if appropriate with respect to the environment of the interview. Learn to manage your own emotional filters, personal blinders and biases, which can keep you from hearing what is really being said. So don't bring, as I've said before, don't get influenced by the biases that you as a requirements engineer have developed for one reason or the other, and listen to what is being said so that you can process that information correctly. If you don't listen to the message correctly, then it is natural that you are going to not process that information correctly. And if you are not going to process that information correctly, you are not going to analyze it correctly, you are not going to build the requirements model correctly. So the key to requirements elicitation is hearing and listening the message correctly. The second point that you see listed on the chart is interpreting the message. Observe speakers' non-verbal cues, which consist of gestures, facial expressions, and tone of voice. Some things, when they are said in such a tone that the person who is saying is not convinced of the message. You must, as a requirements engineer, understand the level of conviction from the tone of the voice, and then you must factor them into your interpretation. So interpretation of the message is very important because it is going to then reflect into impressions that you will be jotting down after the interview is complete. Listen for the attitudes and motives behind the words. Obviously, every word has a meaning and there are synonyms, but selection of one particular verb, one particular word over another, or one particular synonym over another, and means something. And so requirements engineers must try to discover why a person has used this word or another word. Remember that I talked about the word requirement, meaning want, as well as need, in the very first lecture of the semester. And if you want to again understand this concept, I suggest that you review lecture 1 so you understand the difference between what is want as compared to what is need, and the word requirement capture both of these things. And that brings us to another very important thing, and that is they listen for customers' needs and wants. And that would be part of your interpretation. How would you categorize things as what is wanted as compared to what is needed? And then you have to provide a rationale for this during the requirements documentation. You need to put the message that is being given to you in a broader context, and you will only understand that context if you understand the business and the application domain. Then you would integrate what you have heard from the customer into what you already know from the domain and from the business context and the problem that you have been working on from the perspective of the speaker. So you are developing a knowledge base with this interview, and this knowledge base is then going to help you make decisions, right or wrong, for the designers to develop a software product. Non-verbal response to the message is that you need to make an eye contact. You need to nod affirmatively that you are understanding something. You yourself have to use facial expressions and gestures to indicate that you are listening. You should, as I've said before, you shouldn't be a dumb listener. Rather, you should hear the message and respond to it correctly. Now, what is the verbal response to the message? Ask questions and probes to get more specific information and ensure understanding. If you do not understand something, ask the interviewee to clarify that point or provide more information so that when you leave, you have understood what is being said. Rephrase the message using different words to check the meaning. That if a concept is described to you, you can say, if I say this in other words, and if the customer agrees with it, then you have understood what was being said by the interviewee. Make emphatic remarks that acknowledge you understand the speaker's feelings without offering opinions or judging him or her. So you should respond to the message in such a way that, yes, sir, I understand that completely. But you should never make a negative remark about the speaker, or you should never say in an interview that you are right or wrong. You should say, I understand this concept, or I understand your point of view. But you should not say, sir, you are wrong on this point. This is not a data gathering interview. This will then become a political interview, which is not the purpose of this. The fourth stage of listening is evaluation of message. That consists of identifying main points of the message and its supporting evidence. You can say that these are the main points that we have talked about, and these are the evidences that go along with it. We need to clarify facts, perceptions, and opinions. And you need to distinguish between facts and opinions. You must group facts in like categories and logical orders. For example, you can group them as in level of importance or in the chronological order. You need to evaluate the message based on your opinion about the message on the facts, and not on the perceptions, but on the facts. Use the total message, the needs, the context, and the content to follow through on what you hear. So not only that you are going to evaluate this message not just by verbal communication, but also by non-verbal communication, by looking at the answers provided by the stakeholders, by looking at the domain knowledge, by looking at the business context, and then you are going to complete the knowledge base that is necessary for the development of what is known as a requirements model. Then that requirements model can be used by the system designers and software engineers to develop a software solution for the problem under consideration. Interviewing is typically individual activity. It is not considered a group activity. One very important group activity that is useful for data gathering and for knowledge acquisition is brainstorming. In brainstorming, domain experts and different stakeholders are gathered in one room, and with the help of new technologies, video conferencing and other conference calls, this can be done over distributed areas also. But typically, brainstorming sessions are conducted in one room. It's all the participants are considered equal. So a company's chief executive should be treated as a key punch operator who is going to be using the software system. Now, for this to succeed, each stakeholder is given an equal opportunity to speak about the requirements, and each stakeholder is expected to participate in the brainstorming sessions so that a collective knowledge base is acquired, is discovered, which will then be analyzed for inconsistencies and incompleteness. To conduct a brainstorming session, it is suggested that an off-site meeting location be arranged so that everyone feels comfortable or uncomfortable equally. If it is conducted in chief executive's conference room, then the end users and developers may feel uncomfortable in the environment. So an off-site meeting location is preferred for having a group activity like brainstorming. This is also known as facilitated specification technique, in which the knowledge acquisition is controlled by a trained facilitator, and everyone gets an equal opportunity to communicate his or her ideas about the software product. So, and collectively, then that knowledge base will be used to develop the requirements model for the software system. Let's discuss scenarios, which is another knowledge acquisition techniques. Scenarios are stories which explain how a system might be used. Now, why would one want to use a story to explain how things should be used? Because typically end users find it very difficult to describe what they want. They find it easier to describe how they would interact with the system. And a scenario consists of a description of the interaction from a particular stakeholder's perspective. It consists of the normal flow of events in the scenario. It also consists of or contains exceptions to the normal flow of events. So a stakeholder can say that normally I would like the system to operate in this way, and if there are any exceptions, I would like them to be handled this way. And it also documents concurrent activities, that are things which are running in parallel. And it also documents the state of the system when a particular scenario has completed. So a scenario obviously takes the system from one state to another state, and it also documents both the initial state as well as the final state. typically a scenario has been equated with a use case. And all computer scientists are familiar with use cases. We have allocated more than one lectures on discussions about use case modeling later in the semester. So I'll not go into any details on what use cases are, but scenarios have been equated as use cases, and certainly the use cases as we understand them now are based research in scenarios. Remember, we talked about ethnography in some detail in the last couple of lectures. This is based on the fact that people often find it hard to describe what they do because it is natural to them. For example, if you ask someone, how can they tie their shoelaces? And the natural response would be, I can show you how I do it, rather than tell you how I do it. And so ethnography is one of the techniques for observation and social analysis. And we'll talk about this ethnography in a little bit of detail because we have already touched upon it a couple of lectures ago. An ethnographer spends an extended time observing people at work and building up a picture of how work is done. And it also assumes that people are efficient in their work. People try to do their work as productively as possible. And another thing that typically comes out of this is that actual work processes oftentimes differ from formal and prescribed processes. So this will then be the result of the critical analysis that goes on while the observation is conducted. You can see on the chart how ethnography is applied in requirements elicitation. Ethnographic analysis is conducted and the output is produced in debriefing meetings. And ethnography can also be applied with the help of other elicitation techniques like prototyping and experimentation. And as a result of combination of these techniques, better understanding of requirements can be achieved. Ethnography requires that detailed notes are taken for all work practices. It requires that time is spent on knowing the people and establishing a trust relationship. And as a result, it is an expensive activity. That is, it takes time to conduct these, and it takes resources to conduct ethnographically or observational or social analysis type of activities. So on the one hand, they are useful, but on the other hand, they are expensive. And another thing is that the ethnographic activities are not useful for directly eliciting the requirements of the proposed system. Rather, they are useful in getting information about application domain and about how processes are actually implemented. In the beginning of the lecture, I said that we'll focus on interviews as the main requirements elicitation technique to be discussed, which we have. I also mentioned scenarios as one possibilities, and observation and social analysis as another way of requirements elicitation. There is another very useful technique for requirements elicitation, and that has to deal with reusing requirements. If we are analyzing, for example, an entire application domain, then reusing requirements can be an important part of requirement solicitation. And prototyping is also a useful activity for requirement solicitation. There's going to be a separate lecture on prototyping, so I'll not talk about it in any detail here. At this point, we have finished our discussion on requirements elicitation. From the next lecture, we will talk about requirements analysis and negotiation, and we will proceed with other activities in the requirements engineering process. Till the next lecture, I take leave of you and see you next time. Thank you.